0-day brief.
Imagine one security researcher, right? 2 months, 3 massive exploits. And the bugs they found weren't just fresh, buggy code. They had been hiding in the Linux kernel and its virtualization layers for 4 years, 8 years, and 16 years.
Yeah, it really forces a complete reevaluation of, well, the entire code base we trust to run the modern internet.
Definitely.
I mean, finding a 16-year-old privilege escalation bug doesn't just mean a vulnerability slipped through. It it suggests the fundamental ways we test and audit our trust boundaries have been flawed for over a decade.
Right. So today on this deep dive, we are mapping the trajectory of Hyunwoo Kim, the South Korean security researcher who went on this absolute tear.
An incredible run.
Truly. We've got a really dense stack of sources on the table for you today. Security disclosures from the security mailing list, a super detailed architectural breakdown from januscape.io, a GitHub proof of concept, and reports from Google's KVM-CTF program.
Lots to get through.
Yeah, so our mission here is to dissect the mechanics of these discoveries, figure out exactly how we chain them together, and, understand what these dormant bugs actually reveal about the fragility of the barriers keeping virtual environments separated from physical hardware.
And just to set the stakes for you here, if you are running infrastructure today, whether that's highly distributed cloud workloads on AWS or Google Cloud, or even just on-premise private clusters, you are relying on those trust boundaries.
100%.
The whole economic model of cloud computing demands absolute isolation. One instance cannot peek into another's memory, and it certainly cannot, execute code on the physical host kernel.
Right.
And Hyunwoo Kim's research basically provides a masterclass in exactly how to shatter that isolation.
So let's unpack the timeline a bit, because the 16-year-old bug, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was kind of the culmination of a pattern Kim established in months prior.
Right, he was building up to it.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. It's kind of like a building inspector showing up at a high-rise and finding a structural crack in the lobby wall. That was May 2026, when Kim published Dirty Frag, which is CVE 2026-53359 and 43500.
Yeah, Dirty Frag was this really fascinating exercise in subsystem manipulation. It basically involved a page cache write chain moving through the XRM, ESP, and RxRPC subsystems.
Which sounds incredibly complex.
Oh, it is. By carefully staging these interactions, an attacker could create a dirty kernel page, ultimately giving an unprivileged user root access.
Wow.
And that bug sat entirely unnoticed for 4 years, just masking a fundamental flaw in how the kernel handled concurrent write operations across different security contexts.
Okay, so the inspector fixes the lobby, but he keeps looking, right?
Yeah.
1 month later, June 2026, he goes down into the parking garage and finds a crack that's been there for 8 years.
ITScape.
Right. He publishes ITScape, CVE 2026-53359. And this was a massive milestone, the very first public ARM64 KVM guest to host escape.
The blast radius on ITScape was particularly severe, honestly, because it targeted the VGIC interrupt translation cache.
So that hits the big ARM server.
Exactly. It directly impacted heavy-hitting ARM-based cloud infrastructure. We're talking AWS Graviton instances and Google Cloud's Tau T2A.
Okay, so how did it work?
The mechanism was this highly specific double-free vulnerability. Basically, the architecture allowed 2 different code paths to concurrently drain the interrupt translation cache.
At the same time.
Right. And because the synchronization was flawed, neither path recognized the other's operation, so they simultaneously dropped their reference to the exact same entry and freed it twice.
Okay, I want to look at the common thread here.
Yeah.
We have a page cache write chain bug hiding for 4 years and a double-free interrupt cache bug hiding for 8. Why are these specific types of structural cracks staying buried for so long across completely different architectures?
What's fascinating here is that the underlying theme is fundamental tracking errors at trust boundaries.
Like the kernel just forgets what it's doing?
Yeah, pretty much. The kernel is losing track of its own data state. The reason these evade detection for nearly a decade comes down to historical testing methodologies. Yeah, developer testing and even the early fuzzing frameworks, they primarily assumed normal operational traffic. They tested to make sure the system didn't crash under normal load.
They weren't testing for a malicious actor.
Exactly. They did not rigorously test what happens when a malicious guest intentionally and continuously races concurrent operations just to deliberately confuse the kernel's internal accounting.
Which brings us to the 16-year-old crack in the very foundation of the building. On July 6, 2026, Kim publishes Januscape, CVE 53359.
The big one.
The big one. This is in x86 virtual machine escape, hitting both Intel and AMD architectures.
Yeah.
And to find the origin of this, we have to rewind all the way back to a commit from August 2010.
Right. And, August 2010 was a vastly different era for hardware virtualization.
I can imagine. So a developer named Avi Kivity introduces an optimization to KVM Shadow MMU. Let's dig into the mechanics of that specific commit. What exactly did they change in the shadow page table lookups?
So the commit altered a function called kvmCTF. At the time, hardware-assisted virtualization was still relatively slow. KVM relies on the shadow MMU to maintain this software copy of the page tables that map guest physical addresses to actual host physical RAM.
Okay, making sure the guest finds the real memory.
Right, but allocating a brand new shadow page for every single page fault was creating this massive performance bottleneck. So the 2010 optimization aimed to speed this up by reusing shadow pages whenever possible.
Which makes sense, right? Faster is usually better. But how did they actually determine which pages were safe to reuse?
Well, that is exactly where the fatal assumption was introduced. The new code simply looked at the guest frame number. If a shadow page already existed for that specific address, the function just handed it back to the system.
Wait, so they just checked the address?
Yes. By doing that, the commit completely removed a critical verification, step-checking the page's role.
Let's isolate that concept for a second. The page's role. If the address is identical, why does the role matter so much?
Because the role dictates the functional purpose and the layout of that memory page. It tells the system whether this page maps a huge page directly, or, if it maps a lower-level page table that requires further traversal and translation.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Dropping the role check essentially means the kernel is saying, same address, same shadow page, hand it over.
Precisely.
But that's like giving someone the master keys to a bank vault just because their driver's license has the same street address as the bank manager. It feels incredibly reckless.
It's a terrible security metric. Just because the physical coordinates are identical doesn't mean the entity holding those coordinates is authorized for the same operations, or that the data structures are remotely compatible. No. By stripping out that role check for the sake of a marginal performance gain, the 2010 codebase made a really dangerous assumption that the address was a sufficient unique identifier for the shadow page's function.
Okay, so we established earlier that testing models didn't account for malicious intent.
Yeah.
How does a malicious guest actually go about weaponizing that missing role check? What's the trigger?
The prerequisite here is nested virtualization.
Okay, so like a VM inside a VM.
Exactly. The attacker needs to be operating inside an L1 guest virtual machine and then spin up their own L2 nested virtual machine inside of that.
Why is that extra layer necessary, though? What does nesting actually do to the host's memory management?
Well, modern servers use hardware-assisted page table walking technologies like Intel's EPT or AMD's NPT. KVM manages these via the TDP MMU or two-dimensional paging MMU.
Okay.
This modern PDP MMU is lockless, it's entirely hardware accelerated, and it completely bypasses the legacy shadow MMU code.
Ah, so it avoids the 2010 code completely.
Normally, yes. However, when an L1 guest launches an L2 nested VM, the physical hardware cannot natively handle that triple-layered translation. KVM is forced to intervene and shadow the nested L2 page tables in software.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that architectural limitation drops the hypervisor straight back onto the legacy shadow MMU code path from 2010.
That is wild. The moment you nest the VM, you bypass the modern hardware safety nets and land right on the 16-year-old code.
You fall right into the trap.
So once the attacker forces the system onto that legacy path, what is the exact sequence of memory manipulations they execute?
The malicious guest rapidly toggles a specific page directory entry back and forth. They essentially alternate it between a huge page mapping and a standard page table mapping pointed at the exact same physical address.
So they are aggressively changing the role of the page at the address level.
Precisely. They're forcing concurrent page faults while flipping the role. Because KVM is missing that crucial role verification, the hypervisor gets hopelessly confused.
It's just hands over whatever.
Basically. It attempts to satisfy the fault by handing out a direct split page when the context actually demands an indirect page.
When KVM hands out the wrong type of page, how does that corrupt the kernel's tracking?
It destroys the integrity of the reverse map. The reverse map, or RMAP, is the fundamental data structure KVM uses to track which guest pages point to which host shadow pages.
Right.
When the wrong page type is returned due to that missing role check, the reverse map gets registered under an incorrect computed key. The accounting becomes entirely detached from the physical reality of the memory state.
So what does this all mean? It's like an air traffic control system handing off a plane to another sector, but the back-end databases fail to sync. Suddenly, two different control sectors claim the exact same transponder code for entirely different altitudes.
That's a great way to look at it.
The central tower completely loses track of reality, thinking the plane is doing one thing while the reality in the sky is completely different.
Exactly. The kernel memory is effectively flying blind at that point. Once the reverse map is corrupted under the wrong key, the real danger emerges when KVM eventually tries to clean up or remove that mapping.
What happens then?
It looks up their ARM map under the computed key, finds nothing because it was registered incorrectly, and begins to falter.
How does an attacker translate a corrupted reverse map into a full host escape, though?
Yeah.
Where's the bridge between a confused hypervisor and actually executing code?
The bridge is a use-after-free condition. Because the accounting is broken, the shadow page that was handed out for the wrong role ends up being freed by the host kernel. The hypervisor believes the memory is no longer needed.
But it is.
Right. The attacker's guest VM still holds an active mapped reference to that page.
So if the hypervisor thinks the page is gone, but the guest still has a handle on it, what happens to that memory space?
The host kernel's memory allocator marks that freed page as available and eventually reallocates it for another kernel object, perhaps a sensitive data structure or an executable code block. Yeah. Since the attacker still maintains their active reference to that same physical space via the guest, they suddenly have a primitive that allows for fixed, arbitrary writes directly into host kernel memory. They can overwrite function pointers or modify execution flows. They break the isolation entirely.
They literally overwrite the host logic and break out of the VM. That is catastrophic for any cloud provider. But let's look at the broader blast radius, because the documentation notes a really brutal reality check.
Oh, the denial of service aspect.
Exactly. Even if an attacker doesn't successfully achieve that final step of host code execution, simply triggering the initial reverse map corruption causes massive collateral damage.
Yes, and that collateral damage hinges on a specific kernel configuration called config boogun data corruption. If your host kernel is compiled with this flag enabled, the system does not attempt to limp along when it detects internal accounting errors.
Just gives up.
The moment the reverse map lookup fails and the kernel realizes the data structures are corrupt, it intentionally triggers a kernel panic.
It crashes the entire physical host machine.
It brings down the physical node to prevent the corruption from spreading or allowing a silent compromise.
Which means every single virtual machine running on that physical server goes totally dark. That's an instant, massive denial of service attack triggered by a single malformed page table toggle from one tenant.
It's devastating.
If you're a major cloud provider hosting dozens of different enterprise clients on a single physical rack, one attacker can take down innocent bystanders in a fraction of a second.
The blast radius of a hypervisor panic in a dense multi-tenant environment is immense. You lose all state, all network connections drop, and the entire host requires a hard reboot, which initiates this massive failover cascade across your infrastructure.
Wait, hold on. I want to push back on something we just spent the last 10 minutes outlining.
Okay, what's that?
We established that this attack fundamentally requires nested virtualization to force KVM to drop the modern TDP MMU and use the legacy shadow MMU.
Right.
But looking at the security advisories, specifically for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, it explicitly states that an unprivileged local user can trigger this exploit. Why is a local user suddenly a threat if they aren't running a nested guest?
This raises an important question, and that contradiction exposes a severe architectural flaw in default permission models. You are absolutely right to point that out.
So what's going on there?
On RHEL and RHEL-derived distributions, the dev KVM device node is configured to be world-writable by default. The permissions are set to 0666.
Wait, really? So any user account on the host system can read and write directly to the hypervisor device?
Exactly. An unprivileged local user doesn't need to break out of a virtual machine because they are already on the host operating system.
Oh, wow.
They can simply open the world-writable KVM device, manually spin up a minimal, raw virtual machine context, execute the page table toggling sequence, and corrupt the reverse map.
So they use a hypervisor vulnerability purely as a local privilege escalation tool to gain root access on the host.
A bug engineered to break out of a secure container can be leveraged by someone already standing outside the container to take over the entire facility, purely because the interface was left completely unrestricted by default. It perfectly illustrates how trust boundaries overlap in unexpected ways.
A vulnerability with this kind of dual threat capability requires an immediate fix. The patch was merged into the mainline kernel on June 19th by the KVM maintainer, Paolo Bonzini. And the patch itself is staggering in its simplicity.
It really is.
It is literally one line of code. He added a role comparison back into KVM Januscape.
It restores that verification step in the air traffic control handoff. The patch mandates that before KVM reuses an existing shadow page, it must verify both the physical guest address and the specific role requested.
Simple as that.
If the roles do not match, the page is not reused, preventing the reverse map corruption right at the source.
For identifying that single missing line of code, Hyunwoo Kim submitted his research to Google's KVmCTF program, which is their dedicated bug bounty for KVM escapes, and was awarded $250,000.
A massive payout.
Right. $250,000 sounds massive, but when you zoom out and consider this bug lived inside almost every major cloud provider and enterprise data center for 16 years, isn't that the bargain of the century for Google?
Without a doubt, the return on investment for that bounty is astronomical. When you calculate the true cost of this vulnerability remaining undiscovered by defenders, you have to factor in the risk of systemic cloud compromise.
Right. The alternative is terrifying.
Imagine a sophisticated threat actor utilizing this to perform billion-dollar corporate espionage across isolated tenant boundaries. Or, a ransomware variant designed to break out of a single VM and encrypt the provider's entire hypervisor management plane.
The operational cost alone of scrambling a global incident response team to remediate an active hypervisor breach would dwarf the $250,000 payout in the first hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bug bounty programs like KVmCTF are fundamentally risk transfer mechanisms. Paying a researcher $250,000 in a controlled, coordinated disclosure process is infinitely cheaper than navigating the fallout of a zero-day deployment in the wild.
That payout is a stark reminder of the stakes here. Google knows the weaponization window is closing. With the proof of concept code sitting on GitHub right now, malicious actors are likely scanning for vulnerable endpoints as we speak. So, how do operators defend their environments today without just crossing their fingers and waiting for a patch cycle?
Well, the non-negotiable first step is applying the vendor patches. If your infrastructure relies on x86 KVM, deploy the Januscape updates immediately.
And for ARM.
If you are on ARM architectures, apply the ITScape fixes. Because these vulnerabilities reside deep within the host kernel, they persist through guest reboots and application-level mitigations. You must check your specific Linux distribution's security advisories and prioritize the kernel updates outside of your standard maintenance windows.
But what if an organization is running critical workloads, where immediate host-level patching and the required reboots represent an unacceptable operational downtime? Are there, architectural mitigations they can deploy right now?
Yes. You have to audit and dynamically restrict your virtualization attack surface. We know the Januscape exploit absolutely relies on forcing the hypervisor onto the legacy shadow MMU.
Right, the fallback mechanism.
If your specific workloads do not explicitly require nested virtualization, you must disable it. You can achieve this dynamically by modifying the kernel module parameters setting kvm-intel.nested to 0 or kvm-amd.nested to 0.
Okay.
By turning that off, you prevent the fallback mechanism and entirely eliminate the shadow MMU attack surface for your standard guests.
And for the administrators managing Red Hat Enterprise Linux systems with that world writable default we discussed earlier.
The device permissions must be locked down immediately. Execute shemod 0660 on dev kvm. This command restricts read and write access strictly to the root user and members of the dedicated KVM group,
which stops the local escalation.
It instantly neutralizes the local privilege escalation vector for unprivileged users on the host system.
So the immediate technical responses are patch, disable nested virtualization where possible, and lock the KVM device node. From a broader network architecture standpoint, how should infrastructure teams contain the potential fallout of a hypervisor breach?
You must architect your networks under the assumption that guest-to-host boundaries will eventually fail.
Prepare for the worst.
Always. If an attacker successfully executes code on the physical hypervisor, they inherently gain access to all network interfaces attached to that host. This is why strict network segmentation is critical.
Right.
Your hypervisor management plane, the networks handling provisioning, storage backends, and administrative access, must be physically or logically isolated from the networks carrying standard guest traffic.
So keep the control room entirely physically separate from the passenger cabins.
That's a perfect way to put it. If an escape occurs, the architectural design should naturally contain the blast radius to that single compromised physical node, rather than offering the attacker a flat network to pivot into your core infrastructure.
Okay, in terms of active threat hunting, what telemetry should security operations centers be analyzing?
Telemetry from DMESC is your primary indicator. If your monitoring systems capture a KVMU gun data corruption panic, you must treat that as a critical security event, not a routine hardware glitch.
It's an active attack.
It is highly indicative of an attacker actively manipulating the reverse map on your host. Additionally, analyzing hypervisor metrics for sustained, highly unusual page fault patterns across specific virtual CPUs can provide early warning of the page table toggling sequence before the corruption triggers a panic.
So we have a highly actionable defense plan for you. But, looking back at Hyunwoo Kim's 2-month tear through these systems, kind of feels like deploying a one-line patch for Januscape is merely treating a symptom while ignoring a massive philosophical disease in kernel development.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the broader structural issue remains entirely unresolved. Legacy code paths, like the by86 Shadow MMU and the ARM MBGIC interrupt cache, were designed well over a decade ago. At that time, virtualization was largely a niche, trusted tool for developers working in isolated test environments. Today, those exact same code paths are the foundational bedrock of the global economy, tasked with hosting actively untrusted and potentially malicious tenants side by side on identical hardware.
The virtualization use case basically evolved from trusted developer tools to hostile multi-tenant combat zones. But the underlying 2010 assumptions regarding concurrent operations were never really properly re-audited for that new reality.
Securing this infrastructure requires far more than reactive patching. It demands a systematic, proactive audit of every single tracking data structure that crosses a modern trust boundary. Every translation cache, every reverse map, and every reference counter needs to be evaluated against the assumption of a coordinated, malicious concurrent attack.
Because Kim's research definitively proves that the kernel's own internal accounting mechanisms, the very structures it relies on to maintain order and isolation, are the exact primitives attackers will leverage to destroy it.
Time and obscurity do not patch architectural flaws. They simply provide better camouflage.
That's a great point. To briefly recap our journey today, we followed a single researcher's unprecedented 2-month teardown of the Linux kernel's trust boundaries. We traced the origin of a 16-year-old privilege escalation bug directly back to a 2010 performance optimization that traded security verification for speed.
Yep.
We explored the deep memory mechanics of how manipulating page table roles corrupts the hypervisor's reverse map, leading to catastrophic use after free vulnerabilities. And we examined how a single line of code finally closed a vulnerability that exposed the entire global cloud infrastructure.
It is a critical case study in how technical debt at the lowest levels of our infrastructure compounds into massive security liabilities.
Absolutely. So I want to leave you with one final unsettling thought to consider. Januscape existed because the modern massive cloud economy was constructed on top of old niche virtualization assumptions. Today, the industry is racing to deploy next-generation AI workloads, stacking entirely new, incredibly complex, and hardware-intensive abstractions directly on top of this decades-old kernel code.
It's a house of cards.
Exactly. If one researcher could find 3 structurally devastating flaws in 60 days, how many other 2010 optimizations are currently sitting at our most critical trust boundaries, just waiting for the right person to ask the wrong question?
Thank you for listening to Zero Day Brief.